Welcome back to Microeconomics. I'm Keith Akucha. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at rivalrous and excludable goods. So let's just jump over and get started with this. Ultimately, most goods that we've evaluated up to date, we would presume are either, well, are both rival and excludable. But what happens if one or both of these terms begin to break down? So, of course, first we'll need to define what we mean by a rivalrous or an excludable good, and then we'll have to go and explore what the consequences are of not having a good being either rivalrous or excludable. So I know I already said so, but this time I mean it. Let's go jump over and get started. So here we have a grid for us showing four possible different outcomes depending on whether or not a good is rivalrous, excludable, or rival and non-excludable, or excludable and rival or non-rival, and have this bit here up to capacity. Doesn't really help us too much though if we don't know exactly what we mean when we say whether or not a good is rival or whether or not a good is excludable. So let's start off by defining what we mean when we say is a good rival. When a good is rival, what ends up happening is that the person who consumes the good gets the benefit of the good. There is nobody else who gets benefit from that good being consumed. By far and large, most of the goods in the market around us that would probably come to mind are rival in nature. For example, if I were to drink a Coca-Cola, I get the sole benefit from that Coca-Cola. I'm consuming it. No one else is getting any benefit from me consuming a Coca-Cola. Very similarly, if I'm eating a cheeseburger, I get the sole benefit from that cheeseburger. Nobody else is getting any benefit beyond me in my consumption of that, unless, right, there's some kind of situation where you enjoy watching me eat a cheeseburger. Well, if that was the case, then to a degree, there would be some non-rival component to that. That leads us into, I guess, the other side, which is as we move to being non-rival, these are goods, these are services where more than one person can enjoy it at the same time. And so some examples of things that would be non-rival would be a public swimming pool, a park, a museum, a library. In all of these cases, I can go to the pool. You can also go to the pool. We can all access and utilize this good or this service without preventing anybody else from accessing it. Of course, one of the things we need to keep in mind is that there is this capacity aspect to it. And that is, yes, a good may be non-rival. Yes, a public swimming pool may be non-rival. You can enjoy it, I can enjoy it, the next person can enjoy it. But at some point, we're going to come up against that capacity of the swimming pool, at which point, by adding another person, we're no longer able to have adequate room to move around and enjoy that pool, such that now this good has become rival. By adding that additional user, we are now preventing other users from accessing it in a meaningful way. So typically, many things would be non-rival up to some limit, up to some capacity, beyond which point they would then become rival, such that only the ones getting to use it get the benefit. What do we mean then about excludability? Well, what we're getting at when we talk about excludability, whether or not something is excludable, is how easily it is to exclude access to this to the person getting the benefit from it. So again, if we're talking about cheeseburgers, we're talking about a can of Coca-Cola, we're talking about cookies. Typically, in these kind of cases, it's pretty easy to put them behind some kind of glass, put them in some kind of situation, such that you don't get them unless you first pay for them. That is, it's really easy to exclude someone from getting the benefit from consuming this good if they don't first pay for it. However, we do have cases which are non-excludable. And these are cases where it is very difficult to actually prevent them from getting the benefit of this good or service if they don't first pay for it. There are some cases of this where it's just because it's so plentiful, it's everywhere, that there's no real way to get someone to pay for it before they get the benefit. One of the first ideas that pops into my mind is just breathing clean air. By far and large, breathing clean air is non-excludable. I cannot prevent you from breathing unless you pay me first. So by far and large, a non-excludable good in that sense there. Many other examples could be trees, could be many of our natural resources, could be many of our hunting, wildlife, stocks, and the rest. Many of these are technically, much of the natural world would be non-excludable, very difficult to actually prevent me from accessing that resource when I could get away to some very rural area and you would never find out. Beyond that, there's also not just, hey, accessing a resource and using it up for myself, but there's also certain things that we just get a benefit from knowing that they exist. To a degree, several years ago, the Canadian government went to figure out what the value is of polar bears. The fact is, we get some value of just knowing that polar bears exist, even though we ourselves are never going to utilize a polar bear. They are, to a degree, a bit of a national icon, this idea of a national animal, if you will. I mean, they're not the national animal, but same idea. They hold some value, and that value is non-excludable. Just simply by existing, we get some level of value from that. Same could be said for our public green spaces, our public parks. Even if you don't actually go into that park, just having that green space nearby, knowing that that is available to you, has benefit, has value, which you get to extract. And no one's making you pay for that. Even if you've never paid to access that park, even if you never paid for that park to be created, you still get benefit just from being able to know that natural space is there. So, having explained, having defined the difference between something being rivalrous or non rivalrous, having taken a look at something being excludable or non excludable, let's take a look at these four possible different types of goods. Right here, I'll just quickly walk through each of them, say what are some examples of goods that we could see in each category, and then we're going to go jump over and actually evaluate each of, well, we'll evaluate three out of the four. I say three out of the four because we're not going to evaluate private goods because the market has no problem with private goods on their own if there's no other issues like externalities, market power, etc., etc. That is, private goods in themselves don't create any problems. However, the other three are notoriously difficult for a market to actually provide an allocatively efficient distribution of these goods. The market will either tend to overutilize or underutilize such that it creates social problems on whole. And that's really our interest, what we're going to be taking a look at as we take a look at each of these three goods. So starting ourselves off with private, like I said, these really aren't the issue for us. These are most of the goods that we buy and sell on a daily basis. So things like food, clothing, I could keep going on, just anything that you would typically go buy on a day-to-day basis. Your cups of coffee, your cookies, your hot dogs, all of these are private goods. They are excludable. I can prevent you from getting the benefit if you don't pay for it first. And they're rival. If I eat the hot dog, you don't also get to eat the hot dog. If I have spaghetti, you don't also get to eat the spaghetti. They are rivalrous. Only I get the benefit, or only you get the benefit. Going over to our common resource goods then, these are typically, quite often, our natural resources. And in the case of these natural resources, so oil, natural gas, forestry, but this could also be livestock, this could also be grazing lands, this could be our public access to water aquifers and water reservoirs. All of these such that they are there, they are everywhere, anybody could technically access them. They would be these common resource goods. They are rival. If I go and extract some water from the common reservoir, that is now water that you cannot extract, but they're not excludable. It's very difficult for you to prevent me from drilling a well and accessing the water. Or in other situations, just walking up to the stream, walking up to the lake and dipping a cup in and accessing that water. So in that case, they're very difficult to exclude and typically to the point of being non-excludable. So primarily natural resources is what we would throw into that common resource good. Jumping down to the bottom left then, we have our club goods. I gave some examples of these earlier. These are cases where you could exclude access. And what I want you to keep in mind when we take a look at this, it's not about whether or not we do exclude access. It's about how readily, how easily it would be to exclude access. If you could easily prevent access without paying, but just choose not to, that doesn't mean it's non-excludable. It just means you've chosen not to exclude it. So big kind of defining thing there. And I bring that up because an example of a club good that we would often take a look at would be something like a roadway. A roadway is technically excludable. We could quite easily put up tolls and prevent you from driving if you did not first pay to access that highway. So we could exclude access to that benefit unless you first pay. But similarly, that road is non-rival. If I'm the only one driving on the road and somebody else comes in, well, that other person coming in doesn't prevent me from driving. We don't get in each other's way. There's more than enough room for the two of us. So we're non-rival. Of course, up to a capacity. Eventually, that roadway hits its capacity and we get gridlock, we get traffic, and now the extra person has taken away my ability to enjoy this good. Thus, they have moved it to becoming rival. So a road. Other examples like I've introduced would be things like museums. Helps if I can spell. Museum, pools. These kind of situations such that, yes, you could exclude access with museums and pools. You don't get to go in but until you pay the fee at the front desk. And then it is very often the case that all of these are non-rival. I can be at the gym, you can be at the gym, lots of other people can be at the gym, and we all get to enjoy our workout using all the equipment as long as there is under capacity with the number of patrons at the gym, at the pool, at the museum, these kind of situations. So all examples of club goods. Finally, our public goods. So for our public goods, these are ones that are both non-excludable and non-rivalrous. So non-excludable, meaning it would be exceptionally difficult, if not impossible, to make you pay in order to access the benefit. And it's non-rival, meaning more than one person can enjoy this benefit from this good or service at the same time. Examples of this are often things like parks, often things like police and protective services, national defense, radio signals, and fire response. In these cases here, they are non-excludable in the fact that, well, you really can't easily charge somebody for their access to it. And they are non-rival, meaning that up to that capacity, by having these services being provided, many, many people get the benefit. What we're going to do for the remainder of this video is work through each of these three that are either non-excludable or non-rival, to evaluate what is the problem with them, why the free market on its own cannot or does not provide and allocate of the efficient distribution of these goods or services, and take a look at some steps that the government may want to take in order to attempt to correct that market failure, if they so choose. Let's start off by taking a look at public goods, and then we'll move from there. So let's go jump over and take a look. Okay, so taking a look at a public good, let's just ignore this top bit for the moment here. What I want us to take a look at is this bottom left and bottom right. Oh, what I want us to take a look at is this bottom left and this bottom right diagram. That is, you could imagine this bottom left one. This is the personal demand curve for some individual or their marginal private benefit, such that, okay, just them as an individual person, they have a reservation price of 30. That's where they would start to consider buying or contributing towards this. Let's say this is a park. So they would be willing to start to contribute towards this park if it was a price of 30. And then how much park is provided, we would get a decreasing willingness to pay as we go across. What we'll presume is that altogether there are 10 people in this community who would either contribute or benefit from this local small neighborhood park being created. Well, we've gone through creating what we would call altogether our market demand curve. And this would be our market demand curve. I have there marginal benefit. I want to get rid of that because it won't be our marginal benefit actually. This will just be our market demand, or of course, the other alternative interpretation would be our maximum willingness to pay. And I guess in some ways, this demand would be our marginal private benefit. Okay, well, if there's 10 people altogether in this market, how do we build this? Well, at a price of 10, well, let's start off. Let's start off right at the bottom. At a price of 0, if it was 0, we would want altogether 15 units of parkland. There's 10 of us. Each of us want 15 units of parkland, so 15 times 10 would be at a price of 0. We would want 150 units of parkland altogether. However, as the cost of parkland goes up, we want to have less parkland altogether. That is, the cost to our marginal benefit begins to fall, such that at a cost of $10, we only want 10 units of parkland. All 10 of us want 10 units of parkland, so at a price of $10, we would want altogether 100 units of parkland. Keep going at 20. We individually want 5. There's 10 of us, so altogether we would want 50 units of parkland if our cost per unit of parkland was $20. And then, of course, at a price of $30 per unit of parkland, we don't want any parkland at all. So altogether, by aggregating what we would say aggregating horizontally, keeping the prices fixed and figuring out what our quantity demanded is at every price, we get our market demand curve, or similarly, the maximum amount we're each individually willing to pay for that amount of units of parkland. Here's the problem though. If this good is both non-rivalrous and non-excludable, big part here is being non-rivalrous. If let's just pick this point here because I haven't drawn on it too much yet. Let's say we decide to produce 5 units of parkland. Well, using this marginal private benefit interpretation of this curve, we can say that, hey, at 5 units of parkland, I, as an individual, get a marginal benefit. That is, my extra benefit from that extra unit of parkland is $20. So $20 of benefit being received from that 5th unit of parkland. Here's the thing, though. It's non-rivalrous. It's not like I'm the only one who gets that $20 of benefit. All 10 of us do. So in this case, when we are going through, and I want to get rid of the demand here, this should just say our marginal social benefit. As we go through, I get $20 of benefit from that parkland. The next guy gets $20 of benefit from that parkland. So does the next one, the next one, the next one. That is, all 10 people in this society get this $20 of benefit from that 5th unit of parkland. So 20 times 10 gives us $200 worth of benefit for that 5th unit of parkland that was created. Of course, we could figure out that 0 point as well. Where is our reservation entrance? Well, 30 was the individual, 30 for all 10 of them. That's going to give us 300 up there for that point. At 10 units of parkland being provided, I would get $10 of benefit. So does everybody else. Everybody, because it's non-rivalrous, we all get to access the park. We all get $10 of benefit. So altogether, we would get $100 of societal benefit if 10 units of parkland were being provided. What we should see here is that we get our marginal social benefit, which, okay, looks very similar, but you take a look at the scale and you're like, ooh, those are very different scale, such that the marginal social benefit is very, very different than the demand, or, like I said, we could also call this our marginal private benefit. So let's go take a look at what that discrepancy would actually look like. And to do so, let's just draw it on the same axes. So if we were to do so, let's just clean up a little bit here so I have some room. Okay, let's start off by taking a look at our market demand curve. That is altogether what we would be willing to pay for parkland in this community. What we see is that the most we'd be willing to pay is $30 for, well, that's right where we'd enter considering contributing to parkland. And then decreasing from there as more and more parkland gets contributed. So starting off, we'll go quite low altogether. We get something that looks like that as our demand or our marginal private benefit. And that, of course, is going from $30 all the way out to over here, $150. And that would be what we'd be willing to pay to provide parkland if they said, hey, we're only going to build this park if you're actually going to put money forward for it. That's our willingness to pay curve. However, what's our social benefit curve from this parkland being provided? Let's go and draw that one. So in this case, our reservation, our entrance price is at a price of 300. So that's 30, somewhere up here. But we drop off such that we don't really get any social benefit beyond 15 units of parks being provided. So altogether, we get something that looks like this. That would be our marginal social benefit curve. So marginal social benefit, that's the extra benefit to society for every extra parkland provided. And of course, where did that come from? That was $300 is what we would start to get just by introducing that first bit of park, and then all the way to 15 parks being provided all together. What we see is a massive discrepancy here. Then we need to introduce this whole fact that it is non-excludable. Oops, let's try that again. Non-excludable, meaning you can't really readily charge somebody for using the park. You can't just collect your money to pay for this park by saying, hey, before you come into the playground, you have to pay $1 before you use the slide. Right? That's never going to work. People are just going to, irrespective, get some level of benefit knowing that that park is there, and people probably just aren't going to pay, nor is there any way to really enforce them paying for that park. So there's no ready way to exclude access to only those who paid for it. Altogether, what do we end up getting? Well, what we end up getting is this classic free rider problem, where everybody will get the benefit of this park being provided, irrespective of whether they pay. There's no way to make me pay, so I sure hope everybody else pays and that park gets made anyways. Additionally, in this case where it's non-excludable, we have to ask our question, well, what is the extra cost for an extra person going to this park? And the answer is, because it's non-rivalrous, there really isn't an extra cost for an extra person using the park. Right? We build a playground. Great. There's no some cost if the first person uses the playground. There's no increasing cost if the second person. No increasing cost if the third, fourth, fifth, on and on and on. That is, what we see is that really our marginal private cost and our marginal social costs, these are equal to zero. Mind you, I should throw in the caveat, they're up to capacity, but we'll pretend that really the capacity for this park is so large that we don't even need to worry about that. So we can just say, hey, private cost, social cost, the extra cost for an extra user is zero at this point. Question then is well, there's actually no way to effectively price this park because there's no variable cost. For and allocatively for Pareto efficient equilibrium, we must set price equal to marginal social cost. That is how we can effectively allocate resources such that we are allocating these resources in the most efficient way possible to maximize the social surplus. Problem is if marginal social cost is zero, well, really, how do you set that price in order to make any money off of this public good? Not to mention, it's not excludable. How do you even effectively charge people to access this good? Do we see the problem? Do we see why the free market will not provide this good? Or if they do, they will severely under provide this good because of this really, really low willingness to pay. Let's suppose for this park that we are considering, like most parks, like most of these kind of infrastructure projects, it is all fixed cost. So it is all fixed cost. It is all that upfront cost of the site preparation. It's all that upfront cost for the playground equipment. It's all that upfront cost for the landscaping. The extra cost for an extra user of the park is zero. So let's say that we have a fixed cost. This would be our total fixed cost of this park of $5,000. Whoops, that's not a. Let's say $500. That will be a little bit better for our example. Okay, so if the fixed cost is $500 to make this park, we could go and take a look and say, well, okay, if we were to split this cost between all 10 people who are going to benefit. So if each of these 10 people who stand to benefit from this park are willing to contribute, we can build this park. Well, okay, what is the amount that each person would need to contribute? So our fixed cost per person, that would be $500 for our fixed cost, 10 people altogether. We get a cost per person of $50. Okay, there's our cost per person. Great. Is anybody going to willingly donate this $50 to build this park? Well, let's take a look. What we see is that at a price of $50 per person, this far exceeds any one person's willingness to pay. That is, that cost to build the park far exceeds any one person's marginal private benefit. So again, our typical free rider problem, no one person is actually wanting to contribute to this park because no one person is going to benefit enough to make it worth their while. However, altogether, what we see is that society is going to benefit from park space being provided and continue to up until this point here. At this point here, that marginal social benefit equals the cost per person, and we would get our optimal amount of park space that would be provided in this scenario. But what I want you to keep in mind is that if it was left to the free market, based off of each individual's demand, each individual's willingness to pay, not a single person would willingly contribute to this park being built. That is, the only way that we can actually get this park to be built would be if we would have a government who is able to dictate to each person, you must contribute $50. Each of these 10 people then are forced to contribute $50 through taxes, typically some kind of income tax or land tax. And in this case here, by contributing that $50 through taxes, we then create our number of parks that we would be willing to build. And we now get some levels of parks, and we get, of course, our consumer surplus based off of that, such that society is much better off than the alternative of no parks being produced at all. But okay, Keith, the question always is, well, what if the cost to build the park was lower? What if we had a much, much lower cost of building this park? Well, of course, let's go take a look at that. So let's presume that the fixed cost of making this park was $250. And let's suppose, just going out on a limb, that somehow, yes, it's not excludable. We can't make people pay. But for whatever reason, we are just, everybody's feeling altruistic. We all overcome this free rider problem. And everybody, each of these 10 people, willfully donate, willfully contribute $25 to this project, which would be the cost per person, right? $250 divided by 10. The reason why I bring that up is because, well, okay, here's the 30. So something like that is 25. We would get our cost of 25. The result is that cost to our willingness to pay, our marginal benefit, our demand curve, would give us the amount of park space that we would be willing to fund at this total fixed cost. What we see in this scenario, though, is even in this case where, yes, people have a willingness to pay where they would contribute if we can overcome the free rider problem. That's a big if. But if we could, yes, technically the private market could contribute, could get some level of parks being created. What we witness is that at this cost per person, the social benefit is actually even higher. That is, from society's viewpoint, we would actually want more park space being provided than what the private individuals are willing to contribute. So that is, they would still be much better off in the case of a government coming in and saying, hey, we're going to collect a little bit extra. We're going to collect this little bit extra and produce even more park space than what you are willing to do at that point. And so even in this case here, what we would see is that if we could have a public good being provided by the free market, just individual donors out of the goodness of their heart, overcoming the free rider problem, the big result is that we would tend to, well, I'm using the wrong tool, we would tend to under contribute, under provide this public good. It is only through the provision, only through a social construct such as government stepping in to evaluate the social benefit that we could obtain closer to an optimal level of it being provided altogether. Thus, our public good problem. At minimum, it just won't be provided. At best, we will underprovide it. And in either case, we would just run into free riders and we have that free rider solution. That is our only way to effectively provide a public good is just for a government to step in to recognize that all of society would be better off with this good in place. And in that paternalistic sense, the government steps in and says, we're going to do what's best for you, even though you don't necessarily believe it. And through a tax and transfer system, provide a socially optimal number of public goods. In this case, our example is parks. But we could have just as easily looked at policing or fire or national defense, such that every person benefits from those being in place. But what we individually benefit, what we would individually be willing to pay, would be far, far less than what would be socially optimal. And so again, government steps in through taxes, through taxation, to provide what is hopefully closer to that socially optimal amount based off of our social benefit. With public goods now being covered off, let's go jump over and let's take a look at a common resource good and the issues we run into with that. Okay, in this scenario, we're going to take a look at specifically with common resource goods, what would be typically considered a sustainable resource. That is a resource that replenishes itself. Don't worry too much about this little box up in the top right. Really, this formula is not important to us at all. This is a biological formula for steady population. It's not super relevant. It's just here for us so that we can demonstrate this example. So let's suppose that we are evaluating, again, sustainable resource. So I could talk about really any sustainable resource, whether that be forestry, some form of hunting, some form of fishing, anything such that the resource does to a degree regenerate itself. Keep in mind that in this example, we couldn't talk about oil or natural gas or anything that does not regenerate, at least regenerate at a rate that is feasible. Keep in mind, oil, natural gas, and the rest are still common resource goods. We would still approach them in the same way. This example, the way that I've just set it up, doesn't necessarily work for them. We would have a bit of a different construct, but the basic big idea still remains. Okay, so let's say we're talking about fish. So that's the wrong tool. So if we are talking about fishing altogether, we have the supply, the N, the population of fish that are in the sea. And specifically, maybe these are tuna, just to give it some context, let's say. So, okay, we have some amount of tuna fish in the sea. What we should notice is that altogether, the supply of tuna fish far outstrips the entirety of the demand for tuna. As a result, let's just move this out of the way here. There we go. We want this many tuna. That is how many that we want to eat. And of course, there's no real pricing mechanism as to how to charge for tuna. They are plentiful, they are in abundance, they are all over the ocean. And so as a result, it is near zero to harvest and extract a tuna. So based off of that, without any pricing mechanism, at zero, we want this many tuna, altogether our quantity demanded. Now, initially, this looks like no problem. Tuna is entirely price inelastic. And why is tuna price inelastic? Because tuna do not reproduce with respect to changing prices. It is not like tuna are like, oh, wow, the price of tuna is really high. We better reproduce more. Or, oh, the price of tuna is really low. Maybe let's not reproduce very much. Now, tuna don't care about the price that we put on them. Tuna are just reproducing based off of their own natural processes. So there is just some amount of tuna altogether, and that is entirely not at all sensitive to the price of tuna. So completely price inelastic. So we get our quantity supply. This doesn't seem like an issue. This doesn't seem like an issue because we want quantity demanded. There's this amount altogether. Looks like, hey, there's more tuna being supplied than we could possibly want. The issue is, of course, though, is that as we harvest these tuna, as we extract these tuna, we eat them up. We deplete this supply. This is where I want to introduce this formula here. We have the change in the population is equal to their reproduction or their growth rate times the current population, all to the power, or not to the power of, sorry, multiplied by 1 minus the ratio of the population to the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity is how much the entire Earth, that environment, that ecosystem can actually sustain. What we could then do is, if we're harvesting, go minus the amount harvested. In order for us to actually sustainably harvest any resource, this change in population altogether needs to be zero, such that the growth of the population altogether, the amount that is being added each year, births over deaths, is exactly equal to the amount that we harvest, so that we are not growing or shrinking this population. I mean, growing is not necessarily problematic, but we're not shrinking this population and thus depleting it. Not a far-fetched idea to presume that that quantity demanded far exceeds the value that H ought to be in order to match the births versus deaths. The impact of that is as we go and we extract quantity demanded this year, next year, that only leaves us with N1 tuna. That is, next year, we would have fewer tuna altogether because we have ultimately harvested more than what the tuna were able to regenerate in themselves. That is, in this case here, that delta N would have been a negative value. Thus, our supply of tuna is shrinking. Now, of course, based off of this, we should then respond and say, okay, well, if the supply of tuna is shrinking, supply equals demand, we should now set a price on tuna that is positive such that we are restricting the amount of tuna that we are harvesting, at least to a degree. Not massively, but still to a degree. Problem is, this is a non-excludable resource. How do you actually prevent a fisherman from going out into the open ocean that is not readily patrolled, not easily observable, and actually determine whether or not they are collecting tuna? And if they are, how do you charge them for the tuna that they've caught? You can't. You can't easily. Similarly, if we're talking about a waterway, how do you ensure somebody hasn't drilled a well and is extracting water out of the aquifer? How are you sure that somebody hasn't built a pump and dropped it into the lake and is pulling water out of the reservoir? In both of these cases, it is extremely difficult to exclude somebody access to this resource. The result is this continues. If we can't come up with some pricing mechanism, we continue to treat the price as if it's zero. And as a result, in the next period, the number of tuna drops yet again. And again, if there was a price mechanism, we could respond with that higher price. But again, being non-excludable, there's no way to enforce this. And so the result is a spiral downward all the way until none of this resource is left. And we've completely overutilized, collapsed the resource, driven it to zero. And this is what is often referred to as the tragedy of the commons, such that because of our inability to set a price on this, our tendency is to over extract, our tendency is to overutilize this good or service. And keep in mind, we will be able to extract tuna for potentially decades, if not generations, depending on how far this supply line is out to the right beyond our demand. We could, for generations, be overfishing tuna, driving this down before we finally have collapse of the resource. That is, just because it's the way we've always done it does not mean we're doing it sustainably. It just means the resource was so abundant that we didn't have to worry ourselves with the scarcity. However, as it becomes increasingly scarce. And when we cannot effectively price it, the result is it will be over harvested, overutilized, and completely collapse. We've seen this in so many common resources. We've seen this in the Atlantic fisheries. We've seen this in so many forestry sectors. We've seen this in overgrazing of common grazing grounds. In so many of these cases where the good is both rivalrous and non-excludable, we get this situation where the tragedy of the commons holds and we overutilize this resource to the point of collapse, sometimes, and in more than one case, to the point of extinction. To the point of extinction. So the question is, how do we solve this? Well, the way that we solve this is ultimately we want to figure out what is, in this case here, our case such that we can make delta n, the change in population, zero, or even just slightly positive such that the population is growing. If we have overharvested in the past, maybe we want to replenish it back up to some healthy rate. One of the things, and any biologists looking at this, please forgive me in advance. This is definitely your realm of study. This is one of those forays that economics occasionally does into other fields to get a better understanding of the economic context. Doing my best to understand this model. I am sure there are more complex, more nuanced models out there other than this simple one that we are using to make a simple point. The reproduction rate, we presume, is logistic. So that is, if you were to take a look at it, it looks something like this. That is, initially growth or rate of reproduction is going faster, 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 and then begins to slow down altogether. Sorry, that would be our population rate. The corresponding our corresponding reproduction rate would look something more like this, such that it is with respect to the number that we have altogether. And if we have more and more and more, well, then we have a flatter and flatter, slower, smaller reproduction rate. And same when we have really, really low numbers of population, we have a really small reproduction rate. However, in this area here, our reproduction rates are the highest. So to a degree, our rate of reproduction is a function of n. And you can just imagine this, right? When you're really close to the carrying capacity of the environment, food is a bit more hard to find, your reproduction rate is going to be slower. However, as you have smaller, less and less population, but still enough that you can easily find each other to reproduce, food is abundant, resources are abundant, everything is abundant, and as a result, you can reproduce quite readily. As we get down to the left-hand side, well, what we see down here is, yes, resources are abundant, but finding that partner to reproduce with is not abundant, so yet reproduction rates are again decreasing as we go to small of a population. What we can then do is just evaluating this and through our model, figure out what is ultimately going to be our births minus deaths, and then figure out, okay, at which population can we have births just higher than deaths such that we are still able to harvest some amount of this resource to maintain a population that is stable. That is, in reality, we don't want to consider the entire supply of tuna fish. That would be silly. If we consider the entire supply, the entire population of tuna fish, we will easily and rapidly, as we see, overharvest to the point of collapse, to the point of extinction. Instead, what we would want to do is something more like this. What we would want to determine is some harvesting rate. That would be our supply. That would be the amount that we could extract out of this sustainable resource in each period, such that, again, this would be the harvesting rate, such that at this harvesting rate, we can maintain a stable population. That is, the population will not be growing. It will also not be shrinking. It maintains its stability. In this, there are a few different ways we can do it. We can put a cap, we can put a quota, so some sort of cap on the amount of harvesting of tuna that is allowed. And this is partly what is done with fishing, right? We have restrictions as to who can fish. We put out licenses, and we say you only get to if you have this permission to fish. And then we have the Coast Guard and other authorities patrolling, and now in the days of satellite imagery, looking for illegal fishing operations and keeping count, keeping track of how much is actually fished in each period. As a result of this, by restricting it, we are introducing scarcity. And then furthermore, we could put attached to these licenses some price. Some price in order to actually get a license that allows you to harvest H amount, and thus putting a positive price on this good, a positive price on the extraction, a royalty on the extraction of this common resource good. And in doing so, we can set a market price to have our individual private actors respond to and ultimately end up at an efficient, stable utilization of this resource that does not allow it to collapse. this is ultimately what's done in forestry. In forestry, we use a stumpage fee. That is, you have to pay some price for every stump you leave behind. Beyond that, also typically it's a stumpage fee, plus you have to replant N some number of trees for every tree you cut down. And that is, again, of course, to ensure that the population of trees continues to grow such that delta N is stable. If we set H too high, well, we will then start to see a fall in the population. If we set H too low, we will then, of course, start to see the population rebounding. Depending on what our goals are altogether in it, we may set H accordingly. But the big goal with these common resource goods, well, first of all, the big problem is that if we don't put any enforcement, some quota, some cap, some price to access, we will overutilize, we will exhaust the resource. We can fix it by setting our supply equal to some sustainable amount of harvesting, and thus we would need to figure out what that corresponding price is or what that corresponding capped amount is, and then of course create some sort of enforcement mechanism to actually enforce it. This really is where the problem is. Being that the good is non-excludable, it becomes exceptionally difficult to actually enforce this. And the reason being, let's take a look at forestry. Yes, if we have our industrial foresters who are going out there clear cutting blocks, this should be pretty easy for us to identify, either through satellite imagery or through just, hey, people driving through the bush, our park rangers and the rest, and our conservation officers, and noticing, wait a minute, why is this entire bit now logged? Nobody paid for this. Nobody had the right to log it. This is a problem. However, how do you stop the individual? How do you stop the individual small-time logger from going out into the forest and poaching a tree? That is going and just finding a good tree, falling it, and bucking it up, bringing it out on their own. If these small-time loggers are inconsequential, if they are small in the whole scheme of things, it probably doesn't matter. However, if I can make some profit off of doing this and am making some profit from illegally harvesting wood, and then my neighbor finds out, and my neighbor starts doing it, and then somebody else finds out, and they start doing it, and you have all of these small individual people skirting around this cap, skirting around paying this price to access the resource. The result is that we will actually end up over harvesting. And if we over harvest altogether, that will cause that collapse of the resource. And so that's always the concern, always why we need some typically costly enforcement mechanism to actually oversee a common resource good. Then, of course, we're going to, as we typically have, talked about the rules of the game. Those who are in the industry, who are restricted by this and thus have to pay some price to access the good, they always want to try to capture their regulator. They always want to try to incentivize, to encourage the regulator that this harvesting cap should be higher. Always that, hey, you know what? You've set this harvesting cap way too conservatively. We can actually harvest more without extraction, without collapse of the resource. One of the big problems, of course, is if they successfully convince the government that, yes, H should be set higher, like we've seen here, keep in mind, this can sometimes, depending on the population we're talking about, take decades to fall to a point where it is ending up being noticeable and impactful on the overall ecosystem and environment. Sometimes come that point, we're approaching a point of no return. And so it can be done for years before we really catch on and are awoken to the fact that, oh no, we've been hoodwinked, we have over harvested, essentially been captured by that industry interest, and as a result, depleted one of our scarce common resources. And that's, of course, a big problem all the time. one of the big things we're taking a look at this. One of the big examples that we use is, again, access to water. Water is a sustainable common resource. We do have our water cycle. It does replenish itself to a degree, and we do set price of water here in BC. However, right now, the industrial price for wastewater in BC is only about $2.50 per million liters. The question then, of course, is that actually a sufficient price to set the amount of water to be harvested, the amount of water to be extracted, such that we maintain a healthy amount of fresh water in this province? Or is this at a rate such that we are extracting faster than it refreshes, faster than it replenishes itself, such that we are depleting our aquifers, such that we are depleting our fresh water that we all have available to us? And that, of course, is the big question. By comparison, this is very difficult to actually figure out on whole. But by comparison, countries like provinces like Quebec and Ontario, they charge about $150 per million liters. And then they charge extra fees on top for your bottling companies like Dasani or Aquafina or Fiji, the ones that are just bottling your fresh water to resell. In BC, we're not doing that. We're just charging $2.50 per million liters. So I'll leave that for you to consider whether or not this price is accurately set, or whether this may result in an over-harvesting of our natural common resource. Okay, in this scenario, we have our third and final form of goods that create problems for the market on whole to provide. We've taken a look at the public good, which is either just not provided or underprovided. We've taken a look at the common resource good that is typically overutilized to the point of collapse or extinction. In the case of our club good, we end up getting this kind of flip-flop scenario. And let's kind of talk about what I mean by this. What we're going to start off is by taking a look at a roadway. So think about your local neighborhood road, or maybe even a highway or an artery in the town or city that you live in. And what we can presume is that there's some demand of people utilizing that roadway. Now, although this roadway could be tolled, and this is what I want you to keep in mind, even though we're not tolling it currently, it would be pretty easy to put up cameras and just toll drivers as they drive through a city block. In fact, there are many areas around the world that do this. The technology's been there for a long time. So just because we don't exclude, just because you can drive your local roads for free, doesn't mean they're non-excludable. It just means we're choosing not to exclude. However, they're non-rivalrous. So you get to drive on this road and you don't prevent anybody else from getting the benefit of that. Okay, well, based off of that, our allocatively efficient situation should be when price equals marginal social cost. Price should be off of your demand curve. So the other way we can say that would be that our marginal social benefit equals our marginal social cost. Well, okay, right now this isn't really a problem. Up until this queue capacity, which is about 500 people per hour per meter of roadway, and I mean meter is in width of roadway, and that's the typical capacity of a lane, is about 500 people per hour per meter of roadway. What we see right now is that at this price of zero, the current demand is only sitting about here. We could even say that that is something like 300. So you have your road. Your road is having everybody drive on it. There's not really any congestion. There's not really much traffic. And up until queue capacity, well, you're not really restricting or preventing anybody else from accessing, so marginal social cost is the same as marginal private cost, meaning, hey, cool, we are actually allocatively efficient. Cool, great. We have a price to use this road of zero, and at a price of zero, we have that our marginal social cost equals the marginal social benefit. All's well. Keith, what is the problem? Well, okay, hopefully you see what the problem is. if we have a price of 0 in order to be allocatively efficient, down there, what private enterprise, what company in a free market is going to produce these roads at a price of 0? No one. No company in their right mind is going to create a road if the effective price that they get to charge is 0. So the result is that when this good is non-rivalrous, when it is below capacity, there is no effective price that you can charge. However, because these are excludable, we can quite easily put in a charge if we wanted to. So if we put in a charge, so for example, roads you might not see this with because we don't do it very often, but let's just quickly abstract from this example and talk about a pool. Okay. Again, if we're talking about a pool, if you go into that pool, you're not preventing anybody else from accessing that pool. So we're still along this bottom bit here where marginal private cost equals marginal social cost. There's no cost for you to go to the pool. You're not preventing anybody else, so there's no negative there. That is, this pool is entirely fixed cost. It is entirely just, hey, what was the cost to build the building? What is the cost for all the water, for all the electricity? What is the cost for the lifeguards, the front desk staff, all of that? But what I want you to keep in mind is even with that, it doesn't matter if you have quantity of 1 person or quantity of 10 people. You still need that lifeguard. You still need that front desk person. You still need the electricity turned on. You still need all the pool costs. That is, your costs are not substantially changing as you add more and more people using this pool. So again, in this case here, the marginal cost equals 0. And because you are not preventing anybody else from accessing it, you are not putting any harm on anybody else as a result. That is that our marginal private equals our marginal social cost of 0. Question then is, well, okay, Keith, if you're telling me that effectively the price of that pool should be 0, that is what we just said, allocatively efficient, why do I have to pay to drop into the pool? Why do I have to pay to drop into the gym, to the museum, all of these different situations? Why do I have to pay for access? And the reason being is, well, we still need to account for these fixed costs. We still have the fixed cost of building it. Now, of course, there's 2 ways that we can cover this fixed cost. We could pay for it just strictly through general taxation. So that is collecting money from everybody in society through income tax, through property tax, through a consumption tax, making everybody in society pay for part of this pool. And then as a result, everybody gets free access. The other extreme is to recognize that the people using the pool get some benefit. And because they get a benefit and they have a willingness to pay to access that pool, and because this is excludable, that is, we can identify them and we can charge them, we can pay at least these fixed costs through user fees. And this is what you end up paying when you have your drop into the pool, when you have your drop into the gym, museum, etc., etc. As they've identified, hey, you're benefiting from this. Rather than charging everybody, we're going to charge the users that benefit. And we're going to charge you your dollar cost of this fixed cost. Because, of course, it's excludable and we can. The result of that, though, unfortunately, is that means that we have set a price, and we would set a price and thus a quantity that we would use. There's our price. There's our quantity. But what I want you to keep in mind is that here we got our marginal benefit. Down there, we have our marginal cost. Those are not equated. There are people all through this area that have benefit over cost who would be willing to gain from trade from accessing this good, but they can't. So that is what we see is in these cases where we do charge a non-zero price for access when we are below capacity. This creates a deadweight loss, that shaded area, and that we are preventing certain people from accessing this resource, from accessing this good who received benefit over social cost. And thus, by charging for a club good, even though it's just cost recovery, by charging for a club good, we are being inefficient. We have all of these individuals, and typically, if we want to talk about an equity situation, these are often your lower income, lower ability to pay, who would benefit from access to the gym, the pool, the rec center, that are still benefit above cost, but are not able to access it any longer. And thus, dead weight loss, we're worse off for that reason. So, first problem. First problem with the club good is because we can charge, we often do charge, and that creates an inefficiency, that creates a deadweight loss. Let's backtrack to the example we started at, though, which was this is actually going to be our situation for a roadway. And you're like, Keith, we don't primarily charge for roads. You're right, we don't. Which means, again, most roads are allocatively efficient because we don't charge a price to access it, meaning we are at this point here where our marginal cost equals our marginal benefit. Marginal cost equals our marginal benefit, and thus we are efficiently using this resource. The problem is, how do we pay for it? Well, they still, right? Roads have a huge fixed cost. You would then, instead of having to pay for it through user fees, instead of pay per use, you would have to collect all of the funds to do this through taxation, through general taxes. Again, income tax, property tax, consumption tax, through some other tax on some other good or service. You would need to pay for this to be provided at this level. But let's see what happens as our population grows. As we have population growth, our demand for the use of our roadways increases. All else equal, presuming we don't expand our roadways, and for so many just geometry reasons, it's exceptionally difficult to expand our roadways. Beyond that, even this whole capacity thing where I said, hey, 500 people per hour per meter of roadway, this itself experiences diminishing returns. That is, if we add more and more meters of roadway, that is wider and wider and wider roads, that is, if we double, add an extra lane, this doesn't double to 1,000. This actually typically decreases because we get these diminishing returns as people switch lanes and all the rest. So we can't actually just increase it proportionally, double the lanes, double the traffic capacity. No, unfortunately not. It actually diminishes as we add more and more. But that technical side apart, what we just suppose is we've kept the roads the same and we have this population boom. Given this population boom, because we still have this zero price to drive, each individual driver is now making their decision based off of their marginal benefit to their marginal cost. That's their marginal private benefit equals their marginal private cost. This is how much they're going to drive. So in this case here, we have a demand of, say, 700 people per hour per meter of roadway. We have 200 people per hour exceeding the actual supply at capacity. The result of this, I'm sure we've all experienced this, we get a traffic jam. We get congestion. All of this we then end up paying for. We then end up paying for in this vertical distance between that private cost and that social cost. What did we call that? This was from our externality chapter. This was our marginal external cost. This is that social cost that we then have to pay for in the extra time that we just sit in traffic, or the extra insurance costs that we now have to pay due to increased accidents, because accidents, fender benders, are more likely when we have increased congestion. This is the increased pollution. This is the increased gas cost of idling. All of this is the increased cost that we pay of having a social cost above the private cost due to these extra 200 people per hour trying to use the roadway. Problematic. Of course, what you hopefully can see there is we have a point such that if we were able to get to here, keep in mind that still exceeds the capacity. We're still going to have some level of congestion, but just not very much. Things slow down, but they don't come to a grinding halt. At this point, we would have our marginal social benefit equal to our marginal social cost. So that is, yes, roads are getting filled, but they're still moving. They're still motion. They're not complete gridlock. It's not complete standstill. In this scenario, what it means is that we need to have a price, and I'm just going to make up a number here, $5 per person per hour. Something like that. Like, hey, if you want to drive, you're going to get charged $5 per person per hour that you're on this roadway. And as you go through that, as you set this cost to use your vehicle on the roadway, that is, as you set this cost to add to the congestion, people are going to change their behaviors. They're now going to say, wow, rather than just having this time cost, this insurance cost, these costs that I don't really quantify very well, that really is just society paying for a lot of it. If I have to explicitly pay for this in a toll, maybe I'm going to take the bus instead. Maybe I'm going to cycle instead. Maybe I'm going to carpool instead and split this with another driver. Right? That is, by putting in this price, by putting in this toll, we begin to consider what's happening and change our decisions, change our behavior such that we account for this external cost and we get to an allocatively efficient outcome such that our social benefit equals our social cost and we no longer have all this excess social cost any longer. Following along? That is our issue with these club goods, is that if we continued to provide a price of zero, as population grows, as usage increases, the result is that we create this negative externality. So if we continue this price of zero, we essentially create this negative externality, which creates an inefficiency. So when we are no longer non-rivalrous, when we pass capacity, this zero price is no longer efficient. We ought to charge to utilize this good or service. However, if we set this price for access and we set this to be universal to always be this price for access, well, then in cases, we could even say this isn't even new population, low population. This could be rush hour and midnight. What we see is that in rush hour, when demand surges, there should be a cost because there's a social cost to utilizing this resource, to utilizing this good. However, at midnight, when there's low demand, well, there shouldn't be, because at this point here, this is our marginal benefit, but that would give us a quantity which is marginal cost of zero. That would be inefficient. So club goods get into this dual problem. This dual problem that when we are below capacity, it should be free to use. That is the efficient price. When we are above capacity, it should have a positive price equal to that external cost. Equal to that external cost. The problem is in reality, it's very difficult to do this. If we outsource this club good to a private industry to provide, they're happy charging these positive prices. But of course, they're going to be incentivized to keep the total amount of supply, that total capacity low, in order to get higher and higher prices for their goods altogether. If we entirely provide this through public provision and set price equal to zero, well, then we get the failure because we overutilize it and we create this external cost altogether. So the solution to a club good is to have variable pricing. Variable pricing, such that when we are below capacity, we provide it for free, and that is those fixed costs are paid for by taxes. As we exceed capacity, we then start to introduce user fees, user costs, tolls in the case of a road, such that the toll is equal to that marginal external cost. Doing so limits our use of it, limits that negative social externality, and makes us all together better off. And that's the idea of our club good. Okay, that covers off our 4 different types of goods. We had private goods, which the market is able to do just fine. We have our public goods, where we have the issue that the private market either just will not provide or under provide. We have the common resource good, where we have the problem that we overutilize this good, causing it to collapse, or in the case of some animal harvesting, hunting, we cause to go extinct. We then finished up with club goods that have this dual problem, such that if we are wanting less than capacity, they ought to be free. If we are utilizing it above capacity, it ought to have a positive price. The problem is if we cannot meet capacity, the free market will not provide this at that free price. However, when we then provide it through public provision through a free price, and we start to hit and exceed capacity, from an efficiency viewpoint, we should start charging a price, but that often becomes politically unpopular, which then creates a social loss for the rest of us. Of course, if we have a good that is consistently reaching and exceeding capacity, it is essentially becoming a private good at that point, in which case it ought to be, or it could be provided through the private good market with a positive price. However, in any case we fall below capacity, we then have the problem where we are essentially overcharging such that the price is above that marginal cost, and thus inefficient in that sense. That does us for the 4 different types of goods. If you want to stick around, I have a brief little aside to take a look at, which is getting at where this number comes from. And that is because, hey, traffic is something we all deal with. Sometimes this is something that's of interest to people. So if you want to stick around, I'll briefly look at some different options with this. If not, of course, if you have any questions, feel free to comment below or send me an email. Till next time, or stick around and let's take a look at this people per hour per meter of transportation network. Okay, so where does this come from? So ultimately, this source is from the Highway Capacity Manual, and also kind of jerry-rigged from other information from transformativemobility.org, as well as other sources. The pph per meter, these are my own calculations. So what I've done is typically it's recommended that for a typical width roadway, so a lane, vehicles based off of your typical vehicle size, a single lane can accommodate between 1,500 and 2,000 people per hour. Typical presumption is that most vehicles have 1 to 1.5 people in it. Yes, most of the time it's a single occupancy vehicle. So there you go. Of course, this is presuming some amount of vehicle size. What we've witnessed over the last few decades is vehicles have gotten bigger. We've seen more and more trucks on the roadway, more and more large SUVs. As a result, those people per hour actually drops. We can move fewer people as vehicles get bigger. Just entirely a geometry problem. You put bigger things, it takes up more space. If only one person is in those things, that's fewer people. So that means, okay, between 1,500 and 2,000 people per hour, let's say an average of 1,750 people per hour. Typical width of a roadway is 3.5 meters. So if we say, okay, 1,750 people over that roadway in that hour, well, that's 3.5 meter width. So your people per hour per meter of width is 500. Reason why it's helpful to break it down to per meter is because different forms of transportation use different width infrastructure. Of course, you can imagine A roadway, being 3.5 meters, is a lot more expensive to build, maintain, than, say, a bike lane or a sidewalk at only 1.5 meters, being less than half the width. Conversely, data shows that for a typical bike lane, it will fit between 2,500 or 5,500 people per hour before it hits its capacity. So again, we could say 4,000 people per hour. And that's again presuming a 1.5 meter bike lane. To again break it down to a fixed number of units, that is that you could fit about 2667 people per hour per meter of bike lane. We see that it's over 5 times as many people able to be moved over this area than through vehicle traffic. Carrying on, if you have a dedicated bus lane, typically you'd expect between 6,000 and 8,000 people, an average of 7,000 people. Bus lane, same as a car traffic lane, but you're fitting a lot more people in that bus. As a result, you get about 2,000 people per hour per meter of infrastructure. Again, think about each of these meters of infrastructure as just social cost. Society has to pay for this through our taxation. So only 500 people per that meter, per that cost of infrastructure, 2667 per meter per cost of infrastructure, 2,000 per meter per cost of infrastructure. Finally, of course, sidewalks can move between 3,000 to 4,000 before congestion, so average 3,500. Average sidewalk is 1.5 meters, so about 1,000 people per hour per meter of infrastructure. We see the differences here. As a result, we see the cost burden for usage. The reality, of course, is that we need all of them. We have the geometry problem such that if we continue as we have, which is only utilizing this one, this is the most inefficient. If this is people per hour per meter, and each of these meters is some cost that has to be borne by these people, this is the most expensive form of transportation, the most expensive form of transportation and infrastructure altogether, getting increasingly cheaper. Reality, like I said, we need this. We have built a society, we have built our cities around this. However, unless we want to pay increasingly insane amounts to expand and maintain this infrastructure, we need to recognize that we are, let's go back up here, way above this capacity for most of it, and it's way too expensive to expand it. And so the result is either we're stuck with congestion, or we can attempt to shift some of this rush hour demand into cheaper forms of transportation. And by shifting some of that demand into cheaper forms of transportation, we can actually have lower taxes, have less congested roads, and altogether be better off. But of course, there's that crunch period. There's that painful period of transition. As I record this video, we are in the process of putting in dedicated bus lanes down the Trans-Canada. And we see that, yes, while this will be tremendous in the benefits to the amount of people that it can move, already the buses going down the Trans-Canada without bus lanes account for 40% of the people moving along that route. Yet they only account for something like less than 10% of the actual traffic space. So hugely efficient. However, as we're in the process of investing and building in this, we have this construction cost. We have this tension, we have this pain, because we are farther limiting this through all the construction, but we have not yet provided that. So all it does is farther reduce capacity, farther increasing that marginal external cost with no alternative, no substitutions available to us yet. Of course, once that construction's done, the capacity of the Trans-Canada will return back to what we would expect it to be pre-construction. And we will also have this option available, which will be far more efficient and far more effective on a per dollar or per user per dollar basis. And this is one of the big arguments as to why we are looking at, in so many different levels right now, increased transportation options. And it's exactly because of this. The way that we've built, the way that we have currently done it, saying this is your only transportation option or your only realistic, feasible transportation option, is the most expensive that we could possibly even imagine. I mean, maybe if we had helicopters or jets, it would be even more insane. But out of real options, this is the most expensive that we have before us. And by providing alternatives, by providing options, it has the potential to not only greatly decrease our costs of transportation infrastructure, but also greatly reduce this congestion, bring us back, reducing the demand such that we don't have as much congestion, hopefully even start to approach capacity, decreasing the marginal external cost to society. And that is the idea of this. So the next time you hear somebody say, hey, bus lanes, bike lanes are entirely just an ideological exercise that has no basis in any reason to be, you can explain to them that's not true. Furthermore, this is a really interesting one. Next time somebody says, I never see anybody use the bike lanes, they're so underutilized, take a look at this. Let's just presume this is higher. I will give it to them. Most bike lanes are not utilized this much. Let's say in a car lane, you have 500 people per hour. Over the capacity of 500 people per hour, that is, this looks like 100% utilization. You are at capacity. That is, that travel lane looks full. Conversely, a bike lane with the same amount of people, say you had 500 cyclists going down that bike lane in an hour, out of the 2667 that is available for its capacity, well, what does that work out to be? That is, from the outside looking in, that would be only about 18, let's round properly, 19% capacity. So even if we had the exact same number of people per hour moving from vehicle to bike, it would look like that bike lane is far underutilized versus what the actual laneway itself is. And this is, again, one of the realities with bike lanes and why they often look so underutilized is because of the massive amount that they're actually capable of moving. That even same move, and it appears to be drastically underutilized. Keep in mind, say half those people moved, half those people decided, I don't want to drive anymore, I'm willing to cycle. Well, now our laneways would only be 50% of capacity. That's great. That means we're not sitting in traffic any longer. But our bike lanes at 250 out of 2667 would be at, let's just go approximately a 10% utilization rate. They would look empty by comparison. But keep in mind, if we said, look, these bike lanes look empty, they're worthless, let's get rid of them. Where do all these people go? They go back up there. If they go back up there, what happens? We're back at 100% utilization. We're back at congestion. So again, big issue, most inefficient form of transportation. Any investment in these causes a degree of evaporation such that these typically will look underutilized versus the heavy utilization, perceived heavy utilization of the vehicle lanes. And that's really the economic rationale behind these other alternatives. I could have done LRT, I could have done other higher modes of transportation as well. They just blow these other ones out of the water in terms of people per hour per meter. Absolutely insane once you start taking a look at LRT, BRT, and higher forms of transit. So just kept it to these ones for this comparison. Again, this was just entirely extra, just because this is something that people are often interested in because they're stuck in traffic all the time, or they're stuck paying taxes, and it gives that rational argument as to why these are being considered. It's not just an ideological situation. It is a fiscal reality. It is a fiscally conservative choice, and it increases everybody's welfare if we can even just move some of these to alternative transit options, making everybody better off as a result. I'll wrap it up there. I've probably ranted more than I ought to on this. Again, if you have any questions on this part, still feel free to throw it in the comments, send me an email. Till next time.